Thank you so much, Julie, and Shabbat Shalom, and happy secular New Year to all. And yes, my birthday is tomorrow, so thank you all for the birthday wishes. It's truly an honor to be here today, and particularly to be teaching Parashat Vaera, because this year I had an incredible zechut, I had an incredible honor of being published in the newly released Social Justice Torah commentary, edited by Rabbi Barry Block, of the Central Conference of American Rabbis Press, and my contribution was for Vaera, for this week's Parashat. So I'm going to be drawing a little bit on that. We're going to be not looking at that commentary, we're going to be looking at the primary source text, but I'm really, this Parasha is incredible. It has a lot of drama. Many of us will be familiar with a lot of it because we experience it every Pesach. We're at that time in our learning in our Torah reading cycle when we are sort of in this Pesach consciousness. I like to think about it. The first four parshiot specifically of the book of Exodus, of Sefer Shemot, of which Vaera is the second parasha, and as Julie said, not to be confused with Vaera, this is Vaera, is the parasha that introduces us to most of the plagues, and it also really begins with a fascinating conversation about who is Hashem. In last week's parasha, we were told, of course, at the burning bush, at the sneh, that Hashem is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I will be that which I will be. And in this week's parasha, we are reminded again of Hashem being in covenantal relationship with the children of Israel. And the children of Israel are told by Hashem that Hashem will take us out of Mitzrayim, and we will become Hashem's people. However, in Exodus chapter 6, verse 9, and Julie, I'm going to invite you to share the screen so folks can see that verse, we are told that the children of Israel did not listen, could not hear, literally could not hear Moshe because of kotzer ruach. Kotzer ruach, which is often translated as shortness of spirit. It also can be understood as shortness of breath. Ruach can mean wind or breath. And Rashi, the preeminent Torah commentary, the preeminent Torah commentator, says about this that when a person is under such duress, such oppressive conditions, their breaths come in short bursts. They're not able to fully inhale and exhale. And I have had the zechut this week of also participating in a meditation retreat on Zoom. And we talk a lot about returning to the anchor, returning to that nishima, to the breath. There are a couple of words in Hebrew we use for breath. Ruach is one of them, as in this verse. Nishima is another one, which is of course related to nishama. And ruach is again another one of the levels of the soul. So breath and soul are deeply intertwined. And so Rashi here is arguing that Bnei Yisrael was so under oppression and so I don't even know the right word to say, like a heavy weight on them, such that they literally could not breathe, could not take a full breath. The conditions were so heavy. And I think that a lot of us can relate to this in any number of ways, and not only in our own lives, but in the world. But what's really interesting here is that the notion of not being able to take a breath, being of shortness of spirit, shortness of breath, not being able to hear that conditions will improve, feels so resonant for where we are right now. And it feels so resonant for lots of people in different parts of their lives. So in my commentary on Vaera, I specifically talk about the kotzer ruach as it relates to internalized oppression. That's often the term that gets used. Another way we could describe that is the ways in which we as human beings internalize negative ideas about ourselves that are out there in the world, negative stereotypes about ourselves, negative perceptions of ourselves. Particularly, I'm discussing what it means to internalize a negative stereotype about oneself. For example, as Jews and others, we might think about internalized anti-Semitism. What are the ways in which certain views of Jews have been internalized by us in ways that are really negative and disempowering? We can also say for people who identify as women that there's internalized sexism or internalized feelings of inferiority. People with disabilities, we can talk about internalized ableism. And again, when I say internalized ableism, I'm talking there about what it means when you start believing the untrue and the disempowering stereotypes about yourself that exist in the world. How does that affect the neshama? How does that affect the self-concept? In our parasha, we have a really beautiful explanation and an exploration of that in two different parts. In our opening part of our parasha, we are told that Bnei Yisrael could not hear, Moshe could not hear God's promises. Why? Because of the conditions of enslavement, because they were so totalizing that it was impossible to actually believe and understand that there was a way out. I think for a lot of us in different life circumstances that present themselves, it can feel so totalizing that we just do not imagine that there is a pathway out. We cannot conceive of one. We cannot dream one into being. We cannot imagine one. We know in next week's parasha, and Parashat Bo and in Bashalach, which comes after that Bnei Yisrael is redeemed. And we also know that only a fifth of Bnei Yisrael, the tradition understands that only a fifth of the people actually left Mitzrayim. And if we think about the fact that only a fifth of the people actually left Mitzrayim, what does that tell us? That 4/5, 80% of Bnei Yisrael remained. And what does that mean for how we think about the human condition and how we think about our own ability or capacity to believe in a better tomorrow? And fundamentally, I think that that's the consciousness that the Torah is inviting us to inhabit and embrace in these parshiot, and particularly in our parasha this week. A lot of people talk about the theological challenges of hardening Pharaoh's heart. We're not going to get there today, but that is a big theme or motif in our parsha this week. What does it mean that Hashem hardens Pharaoh's heart? How does that relate to free will? In the Jewish tradition, we understand that every person has free will. So what does that mean that Hashem hardens Pharaoh's heart? How does that relate to free will? But I'm interested today in really thinking about the kotzei ruach. And another piece that I want to bring in is that not only did Bnei Yisrael feel a collective kotzei ruach, as the verse says and as Rashi explains, but also we have again in this week's parasha, a continuation from last week, where Moshe Rabbeinu, where Moses, our teacher, doesn't believe in his own capacity to be the Navi, to be a prophet, to be the leader of Bnei Yisrael, who takes Bnei Yisrael out of Egypt, despite the fact that this is what Hashem has said to Moshe. And Hashem says, I am a man of impeded speech. And this, I believe, is purposely ambiguous because it's asking us to think about what does it mean that Moshe is a man of few words and of impeded speech. And we get this twice in this week's parasha, twice in chapter 6, but we really get it particularly in Exodus chapter 4, verses 10 to 16, which, Julie, if you don't mind pulling that passage up, just so folks have it in front of them as I kind of walk them through it. This was in last week's parasha, in Parashat Shmot, but I think it is the most telling experience of Moshe and his self-deprecation. There are a lot of ways that we can read this passage. There are a lot of ways that we can understand what it means to be someone of impeded speech. So I want to offer one particular reading of this that is really drawn from my years of work in the disability justice community, particularly in the Jewish community. And I want to suggest that the notion of Moshe being a man of impeded speech, for lack of a better word, or a man of few words, may have something to do with a speech impediment. People often think about this as a stutter. We have that idea from the Midrash, which is that there was this idea that Moshe burned himself with hot coals, and that's what caused the speech impediment. We don't know what caused the speech impediment. Midrashim, from my perspective, are exploratory possibilities of what could be, but are not absolute statements of fact. And so because we have this tradition of Moshe having some kind of stutter, some kind of impediment that does not allow him to speak verbosely, Hashem says to Moshe, well, I'm quite aware of that. You know, who made you as you are? Was it not I, Hashem? And I want to pause on this verse. Hashem specifically says, who made a person speaking or not speaking, someone who is seeing or blind, someone who is deaf or hearing, was it not I, Hashem? This is a verse that is very complicated from a theological perspective, and this is one of the reasons that I think our tradition is really magnanimous, and that we have the ability to read Torah with Shivim Panim, 70 faces. There are lots of ways to understand this. There is, unfortunately, very prominently in the world, an idea called the moral model of disability, which folks may not be familiar with, which basically means that disability is somehow caused by transgression, God forbid. I do not hold this way at all. And this idea is in the water we drink. It's everywhere in the world we live in. So when we encounter it, we have to work to notice it in ourselves so that we don't feel ourselves imprisoned by it. And yet it can show up in how this particular verse is understood, right? Because if I think about it theologically as, well, who made a person deaf or hearing, seeing or blind? Was it not I, God? If one holds that disability is somehow a moral failing, God forbid, one might understand that as a punishment. If, as I do, one holds instead that disability is a part of the human condition, and that there can be a way of approaching disability from a strengths-based perspective, or as we call it, a social model, which talks about disability being really a function of environment, which I'm not going to get into all of the minutia of the different models, but I'm saying this on one foot to kind of give folks a bit of a framing, a bit of a miscarrot from where I'm coming from. And I don't ask that anyone agree with it. I simply am presenting this as my own perspective. If we think about disability, or what we would call today disability, certainly in the Torah that's not the word used, if we think about that as a natural part of the human condition, and if we think about it from a strength-based perspective, which does not mitigate at all the challenges of having a disability and living with a disability, those two things coexist and can and must coexist, we can look at this passage as extraordinarily empowering. Because what does Hashem say to Moshe when Hashem says, who made blind folks or sighted folks or folks who are deaf, folks who are hearing, folks who are able to speak, folks who are not verbal? Was it not I, Hashem? I made you in my image, just as anyone else, and I want you to thrive as who you authentically are. The fact that you do not communicate verbally in the same way that other people do, that is something about you which I am very aware of. And we're going to make it possible for you to communicate with Bnei Yisrael through using a reasonable accommodation. Of course, the Torah does not say that. The Torah says just simply, here is your brother Aaron. He will be happy to see you, and he speaks readily. He will be your mouthpiece. Effectively, a reasonable accommodation. He will assist you in fulfilling the duties that I have entrusted, because I am Hashem and I deeply believe in your potential. And I deeply believe in your ability to thrive, and I'm going to create conditions that allow for that. And so when Moshe, in this week's Parashat, I think also from a place of Kotzer Ruach, says to Hashem, again, I can't do this. It is so real and authentic And that is a beautiful thing about Torah. The Torah does not try to present humanity as somehow airbrushed and without any complication. Quite the contrary, right? The Torah is, as the rabbis say, speaks in the language of human beings. And so Moshe, not being able to fully internalize what Hashem has said, I believe from not only my own experience, but also the experiences of others that I have been in relationship with, is really honest about how hard it can be to challenge the narratives about ourselves that we really adopt. And whether or not those narratives we adopt are for our own protection or survival, or whether we adopt those narratives because we are very defended, we have a hard time letting people in, we have a hard time being vulnerable. Whatever it is, Moshe's narrative is, and again, when I say narrative, I want to be very, very clear. Narrative does not mean false narrative. Narrative means the constructed story that is based on environmental and personal reality, but that then causes a person to not be able to imagine anything outside of that frame. And so Hashem, in this week's Parashat, after getting frustrated with Bnei Yisrael because of the Kotzer Ruach, also gets frustrated again with Moshe. Because Hashem is saying, well, Moshe, we've gone over this. We went over this in Perek Dalet. We went over this in chapter 4 of Exodus. You have a solution. We've got a solution. It's not a problem. It's put into place, right? It's put into place and we're going to go forward. And yet, I at least can really understand why it is that Moshe himself cannot fully accept that. Because it is very, very hard if one has internalized a lot of negative stereotyping. We don't know what Moshe's life was like in the palace. I mean, think about the fact that in our Parsha last week, Moshe sees that an Israelite is being abused by an Egyptian and attacks and kills the Egyptian. Well, how are the children of Israel supposed to relate to Moshe, who hasn't been basadeh, as it were, in the field, hasn't been, amongst them, b'tocham, hasn't been with them? Moshe has been living in this palace. Moshe probably doesn't have a lot of other people around him that he can really relate to on a deep level. And there's a certain part of his experience that he might feel like he has to lock away and not really discuss and kind of put over there because either people won't understand it or it's too painful or whatever it is. It has to be put over there. And perhaps Moshe's coming to honor himself. I think that there's always a journey of self-acceptance. And of course, Moshe Rabbeinu is Moshe Rabbeinu, and we are who we are. And we can only understand the Torah through the lens of our own experience and through the lens of the thousands of years of commentary that we are blessed to inherit. But what does it mean for us to really inhabit the truth, not only of our experiences, but also the truth that the experience today doesn't have to be the experience tomorrow? This is certainly a spiritual workout for me. I would imagine it's a spiritual workout for many of us. And our Parsha is, I believe, really inviting us into that consciousness of asking ourselves really, really deeply to look at ourselves, to do a deep cheshbon nefesh, to figure out where it is that we have adopted narratives that don't serve us. Again, not because we are going to negate the narratives that don't serve us, but because we want to grow with them and because we want to challenge them and honor. They didn't come from nowhere. They actually came from somewhere. They came from an experience we had. They didn't just come to us out of whole cloth, out of nowhere, and like, oh, where did this come from? Oh, no, I understand. This came from this thing. And then I created this whole other thing. So how do I then navigate the truth of this came from a real experience, and I don't have to predetermine that every experience that I'm going to have is going to fit that narrative. So I think that for all of us, that is something that we can really, really lean into. And as the children of Israel are navigating, what does it mean to leave this centuries-long oppressive state? What does it mean for all of us to, free ourselves from Egypt? Yetziat Mitzrayim is a traditional, it's part of what's called the Six Remembrances. And what that means is that in some communities, after the morning services, this is mostly in Orthodox spaces, after the morning services, people will recite something called the Six Remembrances, which are things that we are to remember always. And one of those things is Yetziat Mitzrayim. And in our Pesach Seder, every single year, we retell this story. Tonight, if you make Kiddush for Shabbat tonight, you're going to say that Shabbat is a Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim, that a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt, as is true of all of the Chagim. They are all a Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim. And in addition to that, we remind ourselves of it twice a day in our tefillah when we say Micha Mocha, twice a day, who is like you. That, of course, is coming up in a couple of weeks in our Torah, but the rabbis make sure that it's in the daily liturgy because this is such a transformative experience. We cannot forget it. We must remember it every day. But how do we get to that point of being able to leave? We get to that point of being able to leave not only through the signs and the wonders, right, which Bnei Israel experienced through the plagues. And I don't know about any of you, but if any of you are hearing the plague song in your head, this is a great parsha to think about the plague song. The frogs jumping everywhere. But we don't just leave. It's a process, right? Just as we first have to hear and accept, right, that actually there can be a better tomorrow. If we aren't there in our own neshamas, if we aren't there in our own minds, well, then how are we going to get there physically? Right? We are deeply interconnected beings, but then we actually experience the plagues, which, there's a lot to say about the plagues in this week's Parsha and in the story in general, and how do we understand them theologically and ideologically, and what does it mean that there are these terrible plagues, and particularly in the world that we are living in today, how do we understand all of that? We'll open it to discussion in a moment, but all of these things, it takes Pharaoh numerous plagues before Pharaoh says, just get out of here, please go. I can't, the plague of the firstborn, which we'll get to next week, really is the turning point. But what does it mean to first really have to work on oneself, then to experience these signs and wonders from God, which of course don't affect the land of Goshen, where Bnei Israel was. But then even after all of that, only a fifth of the Bnei Israel left Egypt at all, with a mixed multitude, and we can talk a little bit about what that actually means. There is a lot of commentary on that, some of which is very complicated and very problematic to us moderns, and some of which we can think about as the Erev Rav, the folks who joined us, the folks who came along. And yet, we are still in that Mitzrayim, in that narrowness. And we can't always hear and we can't always accept that there is a new pathway, whether it's individually through Moshe, whether it's collectively through our experience as Bnei Israel. And one thing I want to say is that there's a very beautiful Mishnah in the 10th parak, in the 10th chapter of Pesachim, which I try to learn every year around Pesach. Pesach is my favorite holiday. I try to learn that parak because it really outlines what the Seder is. And there is a beautiful Mishnah. I think it's the 5th Mishnah of the parak. I don't have it right in front of me, but I'm pretty sure it's the 5th Mishnah, where it talks about that every single person at the Seder is supposed to experience themselves as if they went out of Egypt. because the Seder is not meant as a reenactment of an experience thousands of years ago. It is meant as a collective reliving of the most transformative experience in our people's history. And the author of the Tanya, which is a very important Hasidic work, the author of the Tanya says that, Shner Zalman of Layalti, says that every day, not only every year, but every day, we are meant to experience ourselves as if we have gone forth out of Egypt. Because the consciousness that we are starting to get into this week, that liberated consciousness, it's not only about the Exodus as a big transformative event, but it's also how do we move from that place of Mitzrayim to a place of expansion. And I'll finish just by quoting a verse from Psalms, right, that says that Min ha-metzar, same shoresh, metzar, from the narrowness, karati ya, I cried out to Hashem, anani, I was answered, b'mirchav, out of an expanse, yeah, out of a divine expansiveness. I've moved from a constriction to expansion, and our Parsha really begins that process, and we will continue that unfolding process in the next few weeks, because these Parshiot are deeply interconnected. They are not separate, and they are really allowing us in this very difficult time to imagine a new world. And so I want to stop here. I'm going to open it up for folks to, if you have any questions, comments, any conversation, I'd love to hear. You can either chat that in, which is probably easier if you can put it into the chat, actually. If you do want to unmute, I ask you to please raise your Zoom hand and Julie can call on you. But I think chat would probably be easier, but I'll defer to you, Julie, on that.
Alrighty, well, as folks are writing in the chat and getting their questions ready in there, we do have 2 hands in the meantime. So
okay, great.
We'll start with Susan and Doug.
Mm-hmm. And I'll take them both and then I'll answer them both.
Great.
Can you tell us where you derive the information that only 20% of the, I'm sorry, where only 20% Hebrews left Egypt, and what was the significance of that to you?
Yeah, so that is in a midrash. I'm pretty sure it's in Shmot Rabbah, which is a collection of midrashim on Exodus. I may have the collection wrong, but it is a very famous midrash. It's either in the Mechilta or it's in Shmot Rabbah. And there is this notion that, why do I find that significant? I think that idea is really significant because it's alluding to the fact that even if you are, that human beings, from my perspective, the way that I understand this idea is that it's really, really hard to imagine a better future. It's really hard to imagine that the circumstances that you're in are going to change. We get very habituated. And it can be really hard. I mean, who is this Moshe, right? It can be really hard to say, well, why should I believe that this person who hasn't even grown up with us is one of us and is going to lead us out of Egypt? And it can feel so, if your spirits are really crushed, it can be extraordinarily hard to rebuild that. And this also is borne out in a lot of the reading that I've done by folks who have worked with survivors of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, and other atrocities in the world, that sometimes you can really rebuild your life and you can actually move on. And sometimes you are so deeply shattered and transformed by your experience that you are not able to cultivate that sense because the trauma is so tremendous. And this is something that I think we understand more and more with trauma healing work and attachment theory, and also thinking about post-traumatic growth, which is as real as anything else. So I hope that that is helpful, and I'm happy to take the next question.
Great, thanks. So Mark, and then there's a question in the chat box after that.
Did we have Susan as well?
Susan and Doug were in the same room.
Oh, okay, great, thank you.
Sorry for the confusion.
No worries.
Mark, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I haven't heard before that 80% of the people remained in Egypt, and so that makes me think that that Hashem is only able to influence 20% of the people, and that there may be another influence that can influence over 80% of the people. So Hashem's power is not as great as we may have thought. It's as similar in the present. Is this like a condition of human nature that we're always going to be divided? Like the people today, almost half the people don't want to get vaccinated, even though it's in their best interest. Is there some kind of a force or intelligence that is affecting humans that that even Hashem can't overcome?
You know, Mark, what I would say to that is the $100,000 question. How has human nature not changed over time? You know, I think you raised some very important points there, and I certainly don't have all the answers. But what I do think is important to name is that in the Jewish tradition, we deeply believe in free will, and that Hashem has given us free will, and that therefore we as human beings ultimately are responsible for the choices that we make. So we ultimately decide, this is my perspective on it, is what particularly, we ultimately decide what choices we're going to make because Hashem has given us that power. We can either choose to reveal godliness into the world by acting in a pro-social way, by getting vaccinated, for instance, or we can choose to cling to narratives that don't serve us. And we do, and all of us do a bit of both, right? All of us cling to narratives that don't serve us all of the time. And all of us also can make those changes in our lives, even if it's a baby step. So I understand we have a few more comments.
Yes. So first, a clarifying question. You mentioned a psalm at one point. Someone asked which psalm it was, if you know.
Yes, absolutely. Psalm 118. It's the last psalm of Hallel. Great. And in that psalm is the verse, Min hametzar karati ya, anani b'mirchavya. From the narrows, I cried out to you, Hashem, and you will answer me from a great expanse.
Thank you. And I'll read a couple questions. There's a few things in the chat box here. Moses gave God 5 objections on why he should not be the leader. What's your opinion on this? And then we have a question, a more practical question. Could you suggest any tools to change negative self-image?
If I had that, if I could, I would. Believe me, this is something that I struggle with as much as anyone else. And it is one of those michsholim in our lives, one of those obstacles that constantly appears. It is certainly something that I struggle with. One of the things that I find really helpful comes from mindfulness practice, which is the idea of accepting thoughts as just that, as thoughts and not determinative, right? Because sometimes we get into that space of like, I'm not good enough. And then we automatically jump to, and that's obviously true because I'm thinking it. Or as one of my teachers in chaplaincy would often say, just because you're thinking it doesn't mean it's true, particularly when it's self-deprecating or negative. So if I think, well, I'm not good enough, I can't do this, I can't do that, whatever it is, and that leads into my answer to the next question about Moshe and the objections. I really believe that is Moshe at his rawest and most human, and that is one of the beautiful things about Moshe, and that's one of the beautiful things about the tradition. That Moshe is really a God wrestler, and he doesn't want the job initially. I mean, can you blame him? As we'll see throughout the rest of the Torah, particularly this summer when we get into Bamidbar, into the book of Numbers, and even later on in Exodus, I mean, we get all kinds of complaining and kvetching and, as was asked earlier about human nature. Well, I mean, one of the beautiful things about Torah is that human nature is presented as it really is. So how much of that can we change? I don't know. There's a beautiful book that one of my teachers just recommended. I don't know who wrote it, but it's called Humankind, and it apparently is all about this. So I look forward to reading that myself as well.
Great, thank you. And we have a comment in the chat box, and then Carrie has a comment or question with the raised hand. So,
Sure.
the evolution of becoming, that freedom serves as a touchstone to remember. Keeping this in mind would create a state of continued gratitude. I appreciate the commentary that you shared about our inner doubts keep us from hearing God, as in the Parsha, and going further by listening and remembering that God took us out of our own personal and literal Egypt. That fills my heart with hope.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it is a consciousness that's very alive for me spiritually, and it's something that I know I have to work on every single day, because it's really easy to get into a narrow place and be like, can't make this work, it's not going to happen, things aren't going to change. I had those thoughts this morning. So again, this is the kind of a thing about spiritual practice. We call it spiritual practice specifically because we're not looking to get to a point where we don't experience these thoughts anymore. We're looking to get to a point where we have the tools so that we know what to do when they arise.
All right, Carrie and then Wendy.
Yeah. Hi. I'm just thinking about your interpretation about a fifth of the Israelites leaving Egypt. Actually, I think that's a misinterpretation of the Hebrew root here, chet mem shin, because it actually has two distinct meanings. It could mean like chamesh, 5, or chameshit, 5th, but it also could also be translated as chamushim, or armed, or fortified. And in this case, I think the intention is that they didn't leave Egypt empty-handed. They left with their flocks and with their and also all the jewelry of their neighbors and all that, and also, so in other words, they're leaving with the wherewithal to begin life.
Thank you. Absolutely, that is absolutely there, and it specifically says so in the Torah too, that Bnei Israel is going to leave with flocks and silver and all of that, and we'll see that really in the coming Parashat. Thank you for bringing that in. I think that is, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Wendy.
Hi, Rabbi. Thank you for your discussion and sort of questions that you're asking. And it has made me wonder, is there any commentary on Moshe's doubt of Hashem? He objects to being the leader. Is it possible that the 10 plagues were stages of proof to Moshe that Hashem exists? Because it's interesting that with all the powerfulness of Hashem that we've seen throughout Genesis as well, he doesn't cure Moshe's speech impediment, and he could. So it's made me wonder, this process of the covenant with Hashem is a struggle for all of us, and he doesn't just make it easy. And I'm just wondering if that's in any midrash, that Moshe was filled with doubt about the powers or the existence of Hashem.
Wendy, I love that. I am not conjuring immediately to mind a midrash with that idea in it, but that does not mean that it's not out there. There are lots of different understandings of Moshe and the doubt that he had. And I appreciate your suggestion that the 10 plagues are actually a way of proving to Moshe that God exists. I think that's a really beautiful, beautiful interpretation. And I am not conjuring at this moment a particular midrash where we could find that, but also there's a lot out there. And if anyone in this room happens to have any thoughts on that, I welcome that as well. So thank you. And we will take one more question before we wrap up.
Okay. Kathy says, as a bit of a numbers geek, I'm stuck on the 20%. It has been estimated that 3 million people fled Egypt, primarily Jews. Does that mean there were 15 million Jews in Egypt? Also, what happened to the remaining Jews or Hebrews that were in that didn't go out?
This is an area of fascination for me too, and I think that we just there's so many possibilities. I don't know that we definitively can answer that, but there are lots of possibilities. And I wish that I could, in this moment, like send you all like a link to all of that. But I really encourage us to explore that interpretation, and also the interpretation that Carrie offered us as well, around Hamesh having to do with strong-armed and fortified, because I think that there is a lot of multi-layered